Okay, last video, and this is going to be on experiments and variables. All right, so when you do an experiment, it's a controlled method of doing some kind of investigation. You have a hypothesis that you want to test that's describing the relationship between two variables. So the ones that we're really going to focus on are independent variable and dependent variable. I'm also going to talk a little bit about confounding variables. All right, so independent variable is a factor that is manipulated or controlled by the experimenter. That's what you're going to change. The dependent variable is the factor that is measured. So its result is dependent on whatever you're manipulating. So the dependent variable is what you're actually looking at. All right, so let me get rid of that. A good way to remember this, independent variable is the stimulus or the cause. Dependent variable is the response or effect. So the independent variable causes the effect, which is the dependent variable. Both of them have to have an operational definition. Okay, so what that means is you have to explain what each will look like and how you're going to measure it. That's what an operational definition is. That way, if someone wants to replicate your experiment to try to get the same results, they can base that off of your operational definition. All right, so let's look at examples of independent and dependent variable because that's the best way to practice is the more you look at scenarios, the better you can figure it out. Okay, so an experimenter wants to determine if playing violent video games increases the frequency of aggressive behavior in children. Okay, so in this case, the independent variable is the type of games because that you can change. You can play like puzzle games, violent games, whatever. And what the effect of that is, which is your dependent variable, is the amount of aggressive behavior. Like once you look at examples, it kind of makes sense. So an experimenter wants to determine the relationship between rehearsal, repetition of a list of definitions of difficult SAT vocabulary words, and later recall of these definitions. So in this case, the independent variable is the amount of rehearsal. Do you do it a lot? Do you do it a little? So it's the frequency of rehearsal, and the dependent variable, so what you're testing for, is the recall of definitions. Okay, another one. An experimenter wants to determine if a new drug reduces hyperactivity in children. Independent variable is the drug, so you're going to look at the old drug, the new drug, and what you're testing for is level of hyperactivity. Okay, there are lots of the FRQs on the AP test in the past have given you experiments, and you have to figure out what independent and dependent variables are. So it's really important to know this. A confounding variable is a variable that has an unwanted influence on the outcome of the experiment. Or like what's another possible explanation for the result that maybe wasn't caused by the independent variable. So it's some other outlying thing that maybe could influence the results. All right, so with participants, the experimental group that's exposed to the independent variable, that's the experimental group. So that's the one that you're doing the experiments on because those are the ones you're testing for the results. If you're in the control group, you're exposed to every other condition possible except the independent variable. So that's like the baseline. And the experimental group is the one you're testing to get your results. So for experimental controls, you want to try to have controls on your experiments. So they're used to ensure that all groups are treated the same, except for the independent variable, because remember the control group doesn't get the independent variable. We're trying to make sure that bias doesn't occur so that you don't purposely influence the results of your experiment. So ways to do that is you can random assignment. You can randomly put people in the control group or the experimental group. So that just depends. Like you just like every third person is part of the experimental. Everybody else goes with a control. Meryl and Weston, please stop. Okay, placebos. These are like fake treatments. So this is like when you need to wait. When somebody gets sick, like my kids, when they get sick and they want something to make them feel better, you give them something and you tell them it's medicine and it makes them feel better even though it's not. Mommy. So it's a fake treatment. You can do single blind experiments where the subjects don't know which group they're being assigned to. That way they can't influence the results of the experiment.
Mommy.
Or you can do a double blind, where the subjects or the researcher doesn't know who's been assigned to what group. They just go in, conduct the experiment, and that's it. All right, so good luck figuring out all of the independent, dependent variable worksheets. If you watch this video to the end and are listening, the confounding variables are optional on your worksheet, and if you do them, I will give you extra credit. So
Mommy.
good luck.
Mommy. Mommy.